One of the things we say as a group is that we need to limit air traffic, and that seems sort of anti-aviation, anti-tourism. The thing that we're actually concerned with is a big crash of the industry that happens in 10, 15 years that we can see coming. We're really concerned the impacts of climate will impact the aviation industry itself.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Finlay Asher, Rolls-Royce engineer turned climate activist, who recently marched alongside Greta Thunberg at Farnborough Airport, protesting to stop expansion of the business aviation heavy airport. Finlay and I spar about growth versus sustainability. I share some thoughts on why airlines need to grow a sustainable business, like an economically sustainable business, to then even think about sustainability. And Finlay makes some very good points about degrowth as well as the feasibility of scaling sustainable aviation fuels and why traditional engineering companies like Rolls-Royce need to rethink how they are looking at business. Please join me in this very intimate and freewheeling conversation with Finlay. Finlay, welcome to the show. Can we start with you telling us a bit more about yourself? How did a former Rolls-Royce aircraft engine designer turn into a climate campaigner? And a lot of what you're doing is seeking to limit the growth of the industry as well, which is not making you the favorite person in the airline industry.
Sure. So I am a mechanical engineer by trade. I went to study that because I actually wanted to work on renewable energy to begin with. I've always been concerned about the climate crisis and thought, it's the biggest issue of our generation, and I want to do something positive and practical to try and work on that. When I first looked for jobs, I did get a job at a wind turbine company for a little bit, but when I came to get a long career sort of placement in industry, I ended up at Rolls-Royce, actually working on a jet fighter engine, and I got a really good offer to work there as a graduate, and I went back and I did have, I think it is worth saying that when I first started working at the company on aircraft engines, I always had my eyes kind of open to the fact it was a very polluting activity, and I thought if I can work on the cutting edge technology, making aircraft and aircraft engines more efficient, then because it's a polluting activity, making that more efficient and seemingly reducing emissions is going to be a good thing. I then sort of worked on often future technology. I mean, I've worked on in-service engines, the A350, A330, and that's the Trent XWB, Trent 7000 engines at Rolls-Royce, but also on future technology. So I was working on the composite fan system to replace titanium blades, and also on the UltraFan system, which is a future engine we might see in 2030 or potentially a bit later. And then also on stuff like the variable pitch fan blades. So blades at the front of the engine that literally vary as you fly to optimize efficiency throughout the flight cycle. And I was working on this stuff, and it was very clear to me that it was a very long way off. And actually, we weren't really resourcing this future technology work. The timescales that we were laying out wasn't going to deliver for a long time unless we did lots of work immediately. And there didn't seem to be that urgency, despite the climate crisis. And things kind of changed. There wasn't much talk about that sort of things. When I was talking about that internally, it seemed like a relatively niche subject. It all sort of changed in 2019, where you had a lot more climate protests. The things changed in the political agenda. We declared a climate emergency, and there was quite a few articles that said, well, if it is a climate emergency, should we be flying everywhere? Do we need to do something about it? And that's when I saw my company respond and the industry respond as a whole with this strategy. And I found that strategy a bit problematic. I saw the words in there and the different elements of the strategy. And I was working on some of those technologies, and I knew how difficult it was to achieve and some of the physical limitations. And I thought it was a bit misleading. And I thought this isn't just misleading to the public and to politicians, but also we are sort of misleading ourselves. And this is actually really dangerous for the company and therefore for the workers. So I started an employee sustainability group. I did a kind of lunchtime talk where I went through all the challenges. And I said, does anyone want to work on this with me? Kind of got a group together. We went and explored some of this stuff in detail with the corporate sustainability team, got them in, presented to them what our concerns were, saw what they thought. And that's kind of where I started on this journey. In COVID-19, I was 30 years old, and I thought, you know what, now's actually quite a good time where I can maybe take a bit of a risk with my career, leave my job and get into doing environmental campaigning, because this is what I'm so passionate about. And I just find it completely fascinating and really important. And that's quite difficult to do when you're also trying to fix a vibration issue on an in-service engine. That's a really complicated job as well. So yeah, I left my job. I took a bit of a jump. I started making some YouTube videos. And through that, I met other aviation workers that were equally concerned as me, pilots, cabin crew, air traffic controllers. And that's when we formed this group called Safe Landing. And we're all about aviation workers that want to make a difference in the industry, want to try and move the industry faster on its sustainability journey, and want to empower each other to do that in whatever context, with whatever skills they've got and however they feel comfortable. So that's Safe Landing, and That's what I'm part of now.
Thank you so much for the detailed background. I want to unpack this a little bit. How is this group that you assembled now different from that group that volunteered when you asked them to raise their hands in that lunch and learn you led inside Rolls-Royce? Is it similar? Is it different? Are those people still working at Rolls?
Yeah, that group is still going. And I still talk to them, and actually I'm aware of other similar groups in other companies that I also talk to, and sometimes I go in and give talks at lunchtime actually to other companies in other parts of the world. That happens as well. I think the difference is that when you're just within a company internally, it can seem difficult to reach out to other workers in other companies, and there is something we often find is people contact us and they say, wow, like the stuff that you're saying is stuff that I think myself, and I'm finally finding other people that are saying it. It's great. And they want to share that and share their own frustrations. But then they also feel like they can't speak out about that and they can't say that publicly because it's maybe going against something that's in their company strategy, and they're worried that could have implications for their career, for just the terms and conditions of their contract, right, is to maybe not say anything that might bring the company into disrepute. So even though what we're talking about here is something that we think is really important for the safety and sustainability of the industry, and even though all of everyone at the top of the industry is saying how important and fundamentally critical this is, people still feel often a bit, I'd say, afraid of just having these honest conversations. So part of what we do is there is some of us that have left the industry, or some of us that are a bit more confident, even if we're in the industry, just speaking out publicly or having these conversations publicly. And then other people can input to that, and that can mean that their voice gets heard as well. But also they can take that stuff away and they can do stuff internally, and ask similar questions that we are asking inside their companies.
Right. No, that's a very important point around gag orders, right? You can't really speak usually against your employer, and I see where you're coming from. I also want to step back a little. You said before you even did mechanical engineering, you were already interested in climate change and you wanted to do something about it. I'm wondering if you think far back, how far back can you think, and what was the critical moment where you got interested in it? Was this like a childhood thing? Can you think of a moment where you became particularly interested in this topic?
I think I the funny thing about it, like, you can obviously just read the news and it is there, and it's always been there if you go back to the 90s, you know. I would just say in general, like, probably influenced a bit by my parents. My parents are quite environmental, not in a way of doing this sort of thing. My dad, my dad was a really big influence on me. He actually died a few years before I quit my job, and that really sort of put my career into perspective, and it made me question what I was doing.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. But as well, my mum was just she's big into kind of community gardening and recycling, like just kind of doing everything in a sustainable manner. And I know that I picked that up from her. And I think that's probably made me more receptive to then reading about the climate crisis in the news and being more anxious about it. But also, I've always been interested in technology. So kind of combining those, like working on something that is techie, but also is doing something with a social good, is really important to me, I think. And that's
Right.
kind of why it felt initially like renewable energy would be a great thing to get into.
Okay, so let's talk about solutions, right? We at Simplifying have been studying for the last 2 years all the different pathways to make aviation more sustainable, and we of course have simple things like operational efficiencies, like single engine taxi, to sustainable aviation fuels, to advanced technologies, future aircraft powered by hydrogen or electric. Safe landing, of course, has taken a stance around reducing flying rather than betting on these future technologies. Why is that the case?
So it's important to say that we need all of these technologies, right? All of these efficiency improvements are good. And that's obviously like what I was working on. The thing to understand is that we've been making aviation more and more efficient every year for the past 50 years. And we've had massive improvements in efficiency through all of these things. And we will kind of continue to do so. Although what I was finding is that given our current architecture of aircraft and engines, it's getting more and more difficult to get the same step change year on year. So I think firstly, like a prudent approach would be to assume that those efficiency improvements are going to continue to slow down, rather than sort of assume they're going to accelerate. But then the next thing is, regardless of those efficiency improvements, what we're seeing is that we're seeing more flights, more energy use, and more emissions. And there's actually this paradox, Jevons paradox, where we realize that actually the more efficient we make something, often the more we use it because the costs come down. And actually that can then accelerate total energy use, total emissions. And this has very much been happening with aviation. So it's not that we shouldn't work on that technology. We actually absolutely should. It's just that we need some policies to go alongside that means that we actually tackle the problem. And the problem is emissions going into the atmosphere every year. Now, what we need to limit those emissions and drive them down and make sure they're going down every year towards zero as soon as possible. And within there, those technology improvements then mean we can fly more within that budget. I think it's really important when we think about the climate crisis to recognize this idea of the carbon budget. There's a certain amount of carbon we can put into the atmosphere before we get to a certain temperature level. And that's the physics of it. So that then gives you a budget, and then you've got a choice of what you do within that budget. At the moment, we're kind of ignoring the fact we have a budget. We're just assuming that emissions can continue to grow, and as long as we get to zero at some point, that's okay. The reality is, if we continue as we're doing now, we've got less than 10 years before we blow our budget for 1.5 degrees C, if we've not gone past that already. But also we're going to lose our chance of 2 degrees C in the next 10 years. And you just know, like, if we continue doing what we're doing today, emissions are going to continue to go up, or stay relatively stable over the next 10 years. And that's with every assumption in there of every efficiency improvement, every alternative fuel, and every alternative technology like electric or hydrogen. So it's not that those things aren't good and that we shouldn't be working on them. It's just that we shouldn't let pictures of those things distract us from the policies that we need today and we can't do without. And I think the other thing to recognize, because often in this debate we talk about the carrot and stick, and what I'm kind of talking about here is the stick. And people say, no, we need more. Often airlines will lobby, and this is a problem I had with my company, is they're sort of lobbying against a carbon budget, against carbon tax and other financial measures that might also drive emissions down. And they do that by saying, well, we're going to solve it all with technology. But I think something really important to understand is that policy drives technology. We're actually not getting the technology development we could get because we don't have those policies. Like higher carbon tax would mean we accelerate technological development. And you've seen that in other industries as well. Just because we've got electric cars doesn't mean we don't need to ban petrol and diesel cars at some point. And doesn't mean we shouldn't tax them more and use that money to fund electric vehicles. And all of those policies are what is driving the transition. And if we ignore the policies, then we don't get the technology, and then we don't get the jobs from it either. So I don't think those things are in contradiction. But that, I think, is a big misconception in this debate.
The interesting thing about focusing on growth or degrowth for aviation is that that's right. That punches right in the face of the industry's motive which is growth. And as you've seen, since post-pandemic, there has been tremendous growth. And if you look at the record airplane orders at Paris Air Show or at Farnborough, you've got growth coming. So if I was to put you in an airline CEO's meeting room, how would you ever convince them of degrowth?
Well, I don't think you can individually, and I think this is the problem. So the something I'm going to say on limits to growth or degrowth, whatever you want to call it, is people say, like, well, how can you possibly sell this? Like, how can we work in a world where we don't continue to get bigger and bigger? And how can you sell it to airlines? How can you sell it to air travelers? Everybody. Now, I kind of want to reframe this a bit, and what the question you asked me at the start around what one of the things we say as a group is that we need to limit air traffic, and that seems sort of anti-aviation, anti-tourism. The thing that we're actually concerned with is a big crash of the industry that happens in 10, 15 years that we can see coming. We're really concerned the impacts of climate will impact the aviation industry itself. We're literally seeing it this week with the flooding at Dubai airport. But last year, you saw airlines flying to roads in Greece that was on fire with a wildfire. And Hawaii, equally villages being set on fire. Heat waves that are, massively impacting crops, people's ability to grow food, meaning that we might make areas unvisitable. People can't live there, and then you're certainly not going to go there for holiday. So we're really concerned that we end up in this place in, even 10, 15 years' time, certainly in the 2040s, where we're having to massively limit what we're doing. We've got massive humanitarian impacts, but also just economic impacts. And then that's impacted the industry because there will be enforced limits on flying. At that point, when it comes to actually looking at what resources we have, we'll realize that we can't fly as much as we've projected. And if that's happening, but you just grow anyway, you will overexpand, you'll build in overcapacity. We'll have spent decades and trillions of dollars building all these airports, all of these aircraft, and then suddenly we won't be able to fly them. And that will lead to a loss of investment. Like you saw during COVID, COVID was in many ways a dress rehearsal of this, although COVID was obviously temporary. We managed to recover. There won't be a vaccine for climate crisis. And because of that, we think that is the ultimate degrowth scenario. It's not only is it enforced and sudden and really damaging for the industry, but it's unplanned. And we've got some time, but we need to use that time to transform the industry and to moderate what we do now to preserve the ability to be able to fly in the future. So this is about, we love flying, we love being able to travel, but we want to be able to continue to do that. So I think that's the thing. But then how do you, and I think the reality is, if you talk to a CEO, they know this. Like they know that there's not enough sustainable aviation fuel. They know that they're really going to struggle to hit these targets. There's quotes out there that say offsetting doesn't work. I can go find them from every technology. But the thing is, they're in a system where if they don't grow, their competitors will grow. If you're Ryanair and you say, oh, actually, no, we need to half the number of flights, they know that EasyJet will fill those slots. They'll buy the aircraft. So, and we're in this kind of dog-eat-dog race to the bottom where we sort of can't look outside the current system. And what we need in this scenario is we need government and regulators to step in and to say, this is the budget that you have and you can compete within that, but we can't have unlimited, unconstrained growth where we all suffer eventually. And it's understanding that. But at the moment, we're basically not admitting that's the problem. And we're lobbying collectively against those regulations that would allow us to compete, but within safe planetary boundaries.
So the interesting thing here is I have personally worked with just over 120 airlines and airports in the last 16 years. And a lot of the work has been with chief commercial officers, CEOs of airlines. And here's how, just to share the other side of the scenario, here's how an airline CEO thinks or operates. And I'll differentiate this between developing countries and growth markets. Think India, Indonesia, Turkey, versus mature markets like Europe, North America, US.
Yeah.
And both markets, we can't just say, oh, because Air India needs to grow because the Indian population is growing and the middle class is growing, it's okay to grow there. That's definitely the case. I think we have to be careful here of carbon colonialism, where North Americans or Europeans are telling developing countries, sorry, you can't fly, even though only 1% of Indians have ever flown internationally, or 10% of Indians have ever stepped foot on a plane. Whereas, you've got Swedes taking 4 flights a year on average.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's that's one scenario. I don't think it is right. I don't think anyone has a right to tell a country, please regulate your market and stop growth, despite, places like Indonesia where you have to fly to get around islands. Otherwise, it's a 14-hour ferry ride. And I have taken a ferry ride in Indonesia. It is not pleasant. I do not want to step on a ferry in Indonesia. It's not fun.
Yeah.
So there's the growth markets. Where is the growth coming from? From developing markets like India, Indonesia, and Turkey. Whereas if you look at the developed world, now you may think, 1-2% GDP growth. But let's look at two major hubs where I want to point out my former home of Boston and Seattle. When 15 years ago, Delta Airlines announced its intent to make Seattle a hub, Alaska Airlines responded, which was the incumbent airline, by ensuring that they grew significantly out of Seattle, flying so that they could maintain their market share. And now what you have is two healthy, profitable, large airlines operating out of Seattle. Delta and Alaska are the two largest airlines that operate out of Seattle today. Whereas if you look at the case of Boston, this was announced by Delta again to make Boston a secondary hub on the East Coast about 5-7 years ago, just before the pandemic. And JetBlue did not respond in kind despite being the incumbent, a bit like Alaska, but on the other side. JetBlue did not respond by a ton of growth. And now JetBlue's is a much weaker business model where they are no longer in a financial position to excel. They've been trying a lot of different things. And of course, there's a lot of other things that are in play, but I just want to focus on growth. Why airlines in mature market grow? That is to ensure that they maintain their position in a hub when a new competitor comes in, for example. And why airlines grow in developing markets. And I have to give credit on this knowledge around the Seattle and Boston to the Air Current and the Air Show podcast by Brett Snyder and Ben Ostrower and Brian, where I learned it. But the reality is growth is fundamental, has been fundamental to the airline business's success up until now. How do we change that mindset? I hear you that, we don't have a vaccine for climate change, very well stated, but growth has been critical and it's always been about growth. So we are looking at fundamentally changing the industry here.
Yeah. I think, it's sort of like there's a few different things to get into there. I particularly want to discuss the inequality part and the colonial parks. That's really important. But I just think, just kind of like a metaphor, if we want to get from A to B and we're driving as fast as we can towards there, what I'm saying is that there's a big brick wall in the way. And currently we're accelerating, and someone said, well, we just want to put the accelerator down faster and we're going to get there. We're going to get to maximum connectivity of everywhere and it's going to be brilliant. And I'm saying, but there's a risk. There's a brick wall that's getting closer and closer. I really want us to slow down just now to give us time to think about what to do. I want to then try and change the steering wheel and find a different path around that wall so we can then continue to the destination safely. It's not that I don't want to get there, but I just want to mitigate a risk that I can see. And this is something, in aviation, we're trained to do, like from the very start. We're trained to identify risks and not ignore them, and then mitigate them via lots of different routes. This is what it's kind of doing in my job. So yes, in basically, travel is good, connectivity is good, being able to visit places comes with economic benefits. We need to be careful about then the negative risks that are going to erode all of those benefits, maybe just lose all of that benefit completely, or certainly just really gouge it out. So on the growth from developing countries, if you look at where it's going to come from, like Southeast Asia in particular, if you think, okay, so the problem is, the first thing is we're dealing with physics. Like, there is a certain amount of carbon we can put into the atmosphere and we'll get dangerous runaway global warming, and we can't get away from that. When you then look through all the technology and you realize it's not going to come in time, you then say, well, we do need to limit total fuel use. And then as a result of that, we're probably going to have to limit air traffic. And then you say, well, how do we do that in a fair way? And this is true when you look at other activities as well. Like more developing countries are still using coal and have more emissions intensive societies. And there needs to be differentiated and fair responsibility between that in terms of how quickly people decarbonize and the amount that they pay for that and how they're supported. The thing is, I've been to airport expansion inquiries in the UK, like Gatwick Airport recently, that's wanted to double in size. And this is one of the arguments used, is that, but we need to develop the economies of other countries. And that just feels a bit disingenuous when we're busy expand. If I go to Indonesia and say, I'm from the UK, I think you shouldn't expand your airports and your airlines, they're going to say, wait a second, people in the UK fly 10 times more than us. That's completely unfair. And they'd be correct. So the last thing you can do if you want to have that question about growth elsewhere is to continue to just double down on growth. And we're not seeing, if you look at these projections, that sort of inequality, like in particular Africa doesn't have good air connectivity. It's not like we're going to grow potentially more in Europe and North America than there. And this is something that actually the International Transport Workers Federation has thought about. From a federation of unions, this is quite progressive in saying that actually to be able to expand in countries in the global south, we need to limit and reallocate capacity from the global north. So yeah, I think exactly, if we're going to make this argument, it just really puts into focus the fact that we need to limit what we're doing in wealthy developed countries that fly a lot. And then just on the growth, basically there is growth in terms of what we can do. There is going to be ways of traveling, including of flying, where there will be growth. There will be growth in electric aircraft and potentially hydrogen. However, those require very different airports and very different ways of flying from we're doing now. We're busy just expanding, buying conventional aircraft, building conventional airports. So there's also a question, if you go and look at those countries like Indonesia, if you're wanting good connectivity between countries in a way, islands in that country, in a way that's going to be sustainable and can continue and will remain relatively cheap, then maybe actually we need to like pause for a second and think about how to develop an electric or hydrogen regional air connectivity, air transport network. And that may well look completely different from business as usual airport expansion. So it's also, if there is growth, what sort of growth is there? But certainly just with what we're doing at the moment, there needs to be international negotiation and agreement about what's fair and who gets what from the carbon budget. And this is true everywhere, but I think aviation's in quite a good position where we could be leaders in demonstrating how this is done, because, you know, at the COP process, we don't acknowledge carbon budgets and we don't distribute them. And aviation is inherently international and it's very high profile. And if we can't do that in aviation, like how are we going to do it anywhere else? And that's, you know, something as a group, we'd love to be proud of our industry to be leading the way. At the moment, we're out of the COP process. We don't include international aviation emissions in our reporting at a state level. So we're almost like behind in that regard. And I'd love for us to be out the front really demonstrating how we do this international cooperation and work through this problem of how to distribute the budget fairly.
So let's talk about a very specific example. I know you marched with Greta Thunberg outside Farnborough Airport a few weeks ago. And that was because Farnborough was is seeking to expand its traffic. As we know, Farnborough is not London Heathrow, it's primarily business aviation traffic. So that's another difference there. What is the argument there that in a small airport, which doesn't necessarily add up to bulk of emissions like Heathrow, should not be expanding and adding what I think they said estimated 600 jobs over the next few years because of this expansion?
Yeah, so this kind of idea of it's only a small percentage of emissions is a bit of a kind of, I think, a trick of maths, right? Because it's about like saying aviation's only 2% of or 3% of global emissions, and it's because relatively few people fly, not because it's not a polluting activity. Now, private jets is the absolute pinnacle of that because it's the most polluting thing an individual can do. But obviously, because there's relatively few billionaires and millionaires, there is relatively few private jets. However, like on an individual basis, like it's definitely something that we need to regulate, and not just because of the pollution from it, but it's also just the signal that it sends society, that actually we're going to make you pay for transition to electric vehicle, to insulate your home and to install a heat pump. But Jeff Bezos can fly in his private jet as much as he wants, fill up his jet at the moment, tax-free jet fuel. We need people that are in these positions in society leading by example, and demonstrating that it's not sort of one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. But the other thing is, I just think it's a bad idea for like our vision of what the future of sustainable aviation looks like is minimizing energy use, maximizing social utility. So like maximize the amount people can travel while using as little energy as possible. And we think we should be applying this all over the place wherever we can. And a private jet is an illustration of just how to transport people really inefficiently. It's not designed for maximum efficiency. It's designed for speed. It's not designed in a way that maximizes load factor, the capacity, the number of passengers you can fit in. Often there's only a handful of people on board the aircraft. It flies quickly. They often fly relatively short hops where they spend a lot of time in takeoff and landing. So it's really a kind of case study in like how we shouldn't design our air transport system. And yes, there are jobs associated with private jets. But like we said at Farnborough is an airport very close to London. It could be a zero emissions aircraft hub for the region. Electric aircraft, let's just say electric or fuel cell. We know because of the limitations of that energy storage for either of those concepts, we know we're going to have relatively small aircraft for that. Um, Now that means that if we want to carry the same number, a aircraft quite often will have 100, 200 people in it. If we're then replacing that with aircraft that can carry 20, 30 people, you then need a lot more aircraft. And we know that we can't fly those people into Heathrow if we're trying to replace journeys. So Farnborough would be a really good place, to send if we're traveling from Belfast or from Amsterdam or from the north of Scotland down to London, and you need to get somewhere quickly and you can't take the train. It makes sense to maybe have Farnborough as the zero emissions aircraft hub for London. And that would mean way more people being able to travel and way more jobs. And that's what we're trying to say to the airport constantly in our dialogue, and when I've been on the radio to discuss this as well, is there's actually a cleaner, greener future that's better for the planet and better for aviation workers and better for investors if you own the airport and you want to be able to have infrastructure that can be used continually for the next 10, 20 years.
I like your positioning on how Farnborough can potentially be an electric and sustainable aviation hub. I fully agree that private aviation or business aviation can act as a petri dish for running experiments, given that they fly short hops, short distances, because that's where electric, hydrogen, regional aircraft is where the innovation is, and they can definitely lead from the front. And I like that approach. We've talked about constraining growth, but the aviation industry supports millions of jobs and livelihoods around the world. If flying is constrained, what happens to all those workers? You say you want a just transition. How can that be achieved?
So yeah, we think that if we actually implement climate policies as quickly as we can do, then this could actually lead to more jobs. Firstly, we'll avoid that potential industry crash I was talking about, which will be good for workers. But also, we're going to have to develop these alternative aircraft. We go to more radical aircraft, and that's going to require a lot of money as well. And that's all engineering jobs, design, development, testing, etc. But then also, if you look at if we optimize for minimum energy use per passenger mile, and you look at those radical aircraft, there is an advantage that you could get from also flying slower. So slowing down our air transport network, but actually being able to travel more because we're using less energy. So obviously, if you've got a flight with 200 passengers and it flies 20% slower, the pilot's working for longer for the same passenger miles. The other aspect is with zero emissions aircraft, because of the energy storage, quite likely they'll have reduced range, reduced payload. So we might have less passengers per aircraft. So again, you then need more aircraft, even though we're sort of flying less, flying slower, flying less far. There could be a rebound in employment. So we're kind of firstly looking at protecting the industry and right sizing it in terms of conventional aircraft. But then when you look at the future, it's sort of how can we redesign our airport infrastructure, our air transport network, and our aircraft so that we can fly within that budget, whether it's fossil fuels, whether it's alternative energy sources, while maximizing employment. And those general principles is less far, less fast, less frequently. We think that is the way to minimize energy use, maximize employment, and maximize connectivity around the world in a way that is as equal and as fair and distributed as possible. And to me, that's a really beautiful vision and something that I'd love to be part of creating. But is often, again, it's sort of ignored because conventionally we want to fly faster to get more passengers here to there as many times in the day as possible. So yeah, love for more of a discussion around that and what the future of aviation could look like if we took action.
Interesting. Slower, not faster. That's, I think, a nice way to think about it. Switching tacks a little, we've talked about technologies, we've talked about degrowth. Let's talk about the almost silver bullet that aviation believes is the answer, which is sustainable aviation fuels. You had a strong opinion about the Virgin Atlantic flight, where Virgin Atlantic did 100% SAF flight across the Atlantic last year, and with much fanfare. And I'll tell you why I was a fan of it before we get into your answer. I was a fan not because we can do this for 100 flights tomorrow. I was a fan because over Christmas, that was the dinner table conversation I had, unprompted, with relatives who have nothing to do with aviation and could not spell the S of SAF. But they were saying, wait, did a plane just fly on waste oils and cooking oil from French fries? Shashank, do you know about that? I was like, wow,
Mm.
you know about that? And I thought that was a huge win because Branson gets the word out. And I felt that that was a big feather in the hat for the industry who has been struggling and fighting on the back foot when it comes to communicating about their sustainability efforts.
So I'm interested. Did your family members think were they skeptical of it, or did they almost think like problem solved? Um,
Yeah, they were like, "Wow, I didn't know this could be done." And I'm. Do you know who else can fly it? We spoke for an hour
yeah,
on a topic that I would like you and I would talk about, or I talk with my team at
yeah.
length. And here I was talking with people who work in pharma and in consulting and in technology and finance who have nothing to do with this, who don't even fly as much as potentially we do, and they were very, very interested. So this
Yeah.
interest is what I believe this flight achieved in building up, as much as showcasing that the technology exists.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fine. And obviously, we do absolutely need to test the technology. The thing that then comes out is sort of how do we communicate it, and how does it kind of contribute to us getting towards some of the policies we need and some of the action we need. And there is this danger that we think problem solved, and particularly when um, I have seen phrases like guilt-free flying is going to be enabled, and that sort of thing. I think it's very alluring to think that a technology will magically sort of fix things. We can continue doing exactly what we're doing. Um, we can fly more and more, and it will be problem solved, and also it won't cost that much. Um, so I think, and I think particularly for workers as well, when we hear something like we're only 2% of the problem, oh, and there's this sustainable aviation fuel that can fix it, and that's the answer. We're sort of biased to sort of think, oh, good, okay, I can relax, I can like go back to designing my engine, and I don't need to worry about it too much. And I think it's that we've got to be careful of is lulling ourselves into this false sense of security that it's problem solved. And clearly, so that flight is using a fuel that we've developed a long time ago. It's using waste oil and fat, which is very limited in feedstock. We could probably only get to 2-3% of current jet fuel supply. And then we're going to have to look elsewhere. So like the technology development bottoms out. There's real concerns with fraudulent supply chains, just using potentially virgin palm oil. The UK already, even though we don't use that much, we're already importing the majority of our waste oil from elsewhere. And just from an environmental perspective, if you're collecting waste oil in Malaysia and shipping it halfway across the world to burn it in aircraft here, when there is aircraft in Southeast Asia already, doesn't seem to make much sense. But it's not that it's not a good idea. It's just that when you just do the calculations behind it, you realize how limited it is, and you look at the scale up over the next 10 years, and you realize we're probably going to still keep on growing fossil fuel use. So it's a little bit like when you look at the energy system, people will say, well, we've got wind and solar, this is like growing exponentially. The problem is when we increase our energy use, we still increase fossil fuels. So we need to limit, we do need to scale wind and solar, but we also need to limit fossil fuels. And if we don't limit fossil fuels and distract ourselves with this, then we actually miss the entire point of what we're doing. And this is the risk really, is we spend the next 10 years, we get to 5%, 10% SAF, but in the meantime, we've grown overall fuel use by more than that. And we blow our carbon budget, and we're nowhere near transforming the aviation system. So that's that really. Did you want to kind of discuss my concerns with other, because that's obviously only one fuel type, the waste oil and fat. Often the industry sort of says other waste sources are available.
Yeah, what about synthetic fuels and e-fuels and green SAF through green hydrogen, for example?
Yeah, so and I will say, like, when I discussed this inside my company, it was approaching 5 years ago now. it was basically accepted that carbon offsetting doesn't work and that biofuels can't scale and that electrofuels from renewable energy is the answer. When I then said, oh, well, I've done the calculations for that, we would need for the UK, for jet fuel in the UK, we'd need the entire electricity grid today, fossil fuels, renewables, all. Or we need to have 5 times our current nuclear capacity to make that. Well, actually, that was so Rolls-Royce make nuclear reactors for submarines. They want to get into more of the civil nuclear business as well. And it was sort of the techie response is to say, oh, well, we're going to we can just build nuclear to make the e-fuels. So the problem with renewables is we do need to build them as quickly as possible, but we're limited by human capability in terms of project management, in terms of the time it takes to build it. And it's going to be relatively scarce compared to our energy use for the next couple of decades. So if we add this massive additional load from aviation, it might well prolong fossil fuels on the grid. And if we say, well, we'll mandate that all electrofuels comes from renewables, there's a real danger that we divert that energy from other places where it would have caused even more decarbonisation. And if you say, well, we're not going to do that, we're going to build, and this is one of the things that really worried me, is when they said, well, we're just going to build nuclear. I said, well, you can't just build a nuclear reactor overnight. It takes more than a decade. Oh, we also need 10 of them. And also that's the most expensive form of electricity. So, and I did a calculation and it was okay, so globally we need $4 trillion to build enough nuclear. So how come you're lobbying against a carbon tax that would raise that money? How come we are not factoring a big carbon price into our models when we're designing our engines for 10, 15 years time? And at that point, it was always well, the conversation's over. I don't actually want to go further, when I'm discussing this with chief technology officer, chief engineers, because it's basically, it just shows that it's not compatible. We aren't it'd be fair enough if we said, what we'll do is we will tax all aviation fuel. We'll use that money to buy offshore wind. We'll build our own, or we're going to raise money to build our own nuclear power stations. Okay, but the cost of fuel would go up 5-10 times. And we're talking about that, but then we're not factoring that into our business models. And if you look at it, that is the sort of cost increase that we're expecting. And this is something, when I say about the brick wall, is I think we are at the moment, we're really low cost flying. You put untaxed fuel, it's really cheap. All of that is going to have to end, and we're going to see a massive increase in cost. So do we want to just kind of kid ourselves that's not going to happen and then we'll hit a big brick wall, a big cliff of sudden pricing? Or do we want to ramp ourselves up towards that, stop lobbying against it and plan for it? And that'll really change our product strategy and what sort of aircraft we design, and probably force us to go to much more radical aircraft configurations as well, which is really exciting. Because it involves
No, and I want to talk about new aircraft design as well. Just staying on the topic of taxes, I think we once again must differentiate and decouple certain European countries, or America specifically, versus the rest of the world. Amongst developed countries, you can look at Canada, which has significant taxes on aviation and airports. For example, Toronto Pearson has the distinction of having the world's most expensive landing fee, which then helps to subsidize a lot of other smaller Canadian airports, which do not get a lot of international traffic, for example. And I think that's a policy the rest of the developed world can potentially look at. I think Norway does something similar as well. If you look at other parts of the world, in India, jet fuel is taxed, not just as a fuel, but as a luxury good. And the industry has been clamoring to reduce that tax because it has made flying quite expensive for the normal folk, because jet fuel tax has been expensive. So I think the tax regime is not necessarily common. Where I do agree with you is having this common tax pool which can fund sustainable aviation development. For example, the APD, the airline passenger departure tax in the UK. Currently, it goes in the bottomless pit known as the HMRC. You don't know where that money goes. But if we just cordoned that money off or pulled it, I believe there's enough funds in just that departure tax out of the UK to fund sustainable aviation fuel mandates for the UK itself. So I think we have to get creative about these levies that are already being placed on aviation but are not benefiting aviation at all, to use it for sustainable development.
Although like the counter to that is that the aviation industry is one of the most heavily subsidized and supported sectors, right? So I think it is like the tax breaks that we currently get are massive, and the amount of government investment we get is massive. And that's not necessarily a problem, but you need to be careful you don't incentivize more emissions, and we're careful about what that government money is used for. And I think this, if you think about, so if we raise £1 million from aviation or $1 billion, like what is a good use of that money if it goes into aviation? And what we were saying about electrofuels there, because creating electrofuels from renewable electricity is one of the most inefficient uses of that resource. And basically, if you use the same energy for decarbonising ground transport, you get about 6 or 7 times the amount of emission savings from the same energy that costs the same amount. So I think we also just need to be careful we don't assume that we get these massive financial incentives from government, particularly given the current situation where governments are really struggling with public services, and ultimately, like, we need to also be insulating everyone's homes. We need to be rolling out public transport, electrifying it, all of that as well. I think, the industry has this lobbying perspective where it tries to minimize taxes, and when it gets taxed, it wants those to be routed back to itself. That's obviously a negotiating position they're going to take, but I don't think it's a sensible assumption to assume that's going to happen as well.
I think, just in the spirit of debate, if you zoom out a little bit, aviation is a mode of transport. And let's look at only Europe, for example. What are the other modes of transport? Unlike in America, you can't just buy a car and drive everywhere, let's say to Norway, for example. The distances are huge as well. So you've got train. And I learned recently through the director of civil aviation, one of the directors of civil aviation in France, that railways in Europe are subsidized to the tune of 73 billion euros per year just to maintain operations. So, that's a mode of transport. And if railways is looked as a public good, then a lot of flying can be looked at the public good. I think there's a clear need to differentiate here. Is it that one flight we're talking about that someone might take to Tenerife for a family holiday? Is it that 2 flights you might take to see a sick relative? I mean, flying is a public good in a lot of the parts of the world, and it becomes a luxury good, which should be taxed and rerouted. The taxes should be rerouted both for the benefit of the industry and the society. When it comes to frequent flyers and people who are taking 10, 30, 40, I once took 75 flights a year working within aviation, and I was not the person who had flown the most that year that I knew, being very open and honest. I did manage to reduce this to significantly in the last couple of years down to 15, and the business is still growing. So it's not that I've cut my business down by 1/5 by flying less. So there is definitely an argument there. Let's talk about potentially looking at frequent flyers who are primarily responsible for most emissions.
Absolutely,
you have previously mentioned the frequent flyer tax. How would something like that work?
Well, the idea is, I think, so one thing is, I think carbon tax, fuel taxes, the fuel price going up is inescapable through economics, right? We need to reduce subsidies for fossil fuels and use less of them, which will mean they get more expensive. And if you look at the alternatives, even with the most optimistic cost assumptions, they're going to be more expensive. So the cost of fuel will need to increase. The question then is, like, how do you want to distribute that cost? And ideally, you distribute it towards the people that can pay the most. Now, we don't do that with road transport. Everyone pays the same tax regardless of their fuel and how much they pay. But ideally, you would do that. And ideally, the more inefficient modes of travel would pay more. So, if you're traveling first class and business class for one flight, you should be paying more than someone that's in economy. But also, it really does come down to, like, as you say, like, who's producing the emissions and who's responsible. If we don't tackle frequent flying, we can't tackle the problem, because emissions are so concentrated in the 1-2% of the world that do frequent flying. So it's almost inevitable that we need to tackle that. And we're very far from that at the moment, because we go the other way, don't we? We have air miles schemes that incentivize frequent flying. And actually, this is like fundamental to the growth of a lot of airlines' business models and how they're so successful, is that they really encourage this, and they know that those are their key customers, and actually they get the highest margins from them. And there's a whole marketing thing out there to encourage people to have credit cards and to spend stuff and bump up airlines' profits. So I think there needs to be questions asked about, almost like before you even do the frequent flyer levy, is like, how do you start to unpick that, like airlines' reliance on that? Because almost it then bakes in there needs to be frequent flying. But yes, if you're thinking logically and fairly, you would want that the more someone emits, the more they pay. And because obviously people that have way more money can take on more cost and still do something, that needs to ramp up so that it does impact their behavior. Otherwise, if we just have a flat tax, that we will have obviously lots of people frequent flying anyway, because they can afford the extra cost. So it's a very fair thing to do, and it's a very effective thing to do. And it's something that is being like really dismissed. And we know why, because like I said, it really impacts the way airlines do business. But it's really quite distressing that we're not even having the debate about how it would work practically. We're sort of dismissing it out of hand. The thing I hear from government and from industry is just, we can't collect people's personal data. That would have privacy concerns, as if we don't collect people's private data when they go through an airport by collecting their passport and all that sort of thing. And as if that's one of the biggest challenges we've got in decarbonising our economies. So yeah, I'm a big fan of that sort of thing. I think it could be implemented in different ways, though. And I think it could be implemented in different countries differently to address some of the levelling up concerns you had as well.
That does make sense. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I love this discussion that we are diving into, which is focusing on solutions as much as the hurdles. One of the things is, we're talking about fuels. Is the solution that we should just let aviation burn fossil fuels, but just have this carbon budget and let other industry have the renewables?
So this is something that we've said needs to be an option that's up there, because the thing is we need to be going all out in every sector of the economy to achieve our climate targets, and we need to be maximizing our use of time and maximizing our money on what is most effective, what gives us the quickest bang for buck in terms of decarbonisation. Now, as I say, I think there should be a carbon budget for aviation distributed between countries and airports. And I think there should be taxes, frequent flyer levies, carbon tax. And then you're limiting fossil fuels, you're on the right track, you're doing what you need to be doing, and you're raising revenue. And then there's a question of what we use that money for. Does it then make sense to fund a really inefficient fuel production process when you could use the same money to fund something else that gives you 5 times the emissions savings? That's a really big question. And even within aviation, even if you say we're going to use it within aviation, so you've got different types of biofuels that give different emission savings. And do we fund one over the other? Often we don't have that conversation. We just say everything all at once. And if you look at electrofuels, you've got the choice of either produce the fuel from direct air capture and hydrogen and displace fossil fuel in the aircraft, or you could burn fossil fuel in the aircraft and power direct air capture to take those emissions out of the sky, but then don't create hydrogen again and try and create a fuel. And the reason why I think we should be considering that is if you have a look at the energy requirements for this, you need twice the amount of energy to make e-fuels compared to burning fossil fuels and powering direct air capture. And that's because hydrogen production is super inefficient. The other issue with it is we just not got enough renewables and not enough hydrogen, and we need hydrogen for lots of other things. But if you can avoid the hydrogen production, then it's more efficient. That said, there's a lot more efficient things you can do than direct air capture, which is incredibly inefficient, just not quite as bad as hydrogen as well. So there's I think a balanced approach is needed, though. Like, I think we need to scale some of this technology, but I don't think necessarily it makes sense. And I just think like we need to look at this from an unbiased point of view that's holistic. If you have some money that you can spend on decarbonisation as a government, does it make sense to drop so much of that into aviation versus just into building renewables for the grid that benefits a wider amount of people, public transport equally on the ground, agriculture, everything else that needs to be decarbonised. And if we're going to replace fertiliser use from fossil fuels, we need hydrogen, but we can't put up the cost of food for people that really struggle to afford food. That holds us back, but then we're like maybe subsidising hydrogen for jet fuel at the same time. That might happen, but I think we're going to reach a point in society where we start to have people really struggling to afford food and to afford basics of even getting to work. And at that point, if we realise we're heavily subsidising aviation fuels, the plug may well be pulled. So I think we just need to be realistic about that and actually take like an evidence-based engineering approach to it, rather than just saying, like, I think electrofuels, you can say, oh, well, it's a zero carbon fuel, so it must be good. So let's just scale that. But actually, just actually doing the calculations, it might well not make sense. And I think that's something that we need to address and give an answer to. And actually, no one's ever answered that question. Why would you make electrofuels rather than just burn fossil fuels and direct air capture? I think there's kind of there's political reasons for it. Like, also direct air capture itself is used as a delay tactic. Is if you can avoid burning fossil fuels and releasing them to the atmosphere and distributing, it's then really difficult to recapture them again. Although obviously we do need to scale that technology because we are probably going to blow our budget and we do need some. The other problem with it is often it's fossil fuel companies that get the contract. In Scotland, there's a Acorn project that Shell, the fossil fuel company, is contracted to do. And this is a little bit, if you think about it, is a bit like paying the person responsible for damage to clean up the damage. It incentivizes them to maximize their carbon capture market of the future by maximizing emissions production today. So one thing, just, as aviation being a force for good, if we are going to tax carbon and we are going to fund the scaling of direct air capture, like, why not scale it in the areas of the world that are struggling economically, that are experiencing the largest climate change impacts, and could do with actually getting paid to clean up the mess that other people have made. I really like that idea, and I really like if aviation could be like the leader in that sort of thinking. That would be really powerful. It would make me proud to work in the industry. So yeah, keen to have those discussions as well. Does that make sense?
I think yes, it absolutely makes sense. I think these are very important discussions to be had that are not necessarily happening at this level of depth. There's generally a pushback from aviation CEOs with, oh, we are just 2%, let us grow the way we have. And I think it is important to have these discussions because if not only to address, then definitely to acknowledge that these issues exist and we need to have it. And right now, what I'm seeing in a lot of boardrooms is, yes, there's pressure from either climate activists or investors or customers or all, or maybe governments. And to deal with that, we've got SAF and we are only 2%. Look at textiles, look at shipping, look at why doesn't anyone else talk about shipping, for example. And I think airline boardrooms need to get beyond that. This is the reason why I'm having you on this podcast, not yet another airline CEO talking about what their airline is doing today. And you know what? I'm pleasantly surprised because airlines CEOs typically see climate activists as these young, angry men or women who are shouting and they are very, very angry. You're the second non-angry climate activist I've had on the podcast. The first was not Finlay, Hiske Arts from Netherlands, fossil-free Netherlands, which has successfully sued KLM now and won the lawsuit against them for greenwashing. And she was not angry. Neither are you. And I hope this helps the industry build some trust and not just push back on climate activism without necessarily listening to the argument. So this has been a very good debate and conversation. And thank you for that. I do have one burning question. You said you started off as a mechanical engineer at Rolls. I have personally visited a couple of engine factories and interacted a lot with engineers in our work, and they're deeply passionate about the technology and the technical work that they do. Do you miss that in the work you're doing now?
Absolutely. I worked with some of the smartest, like crazily innovative people that are very dedicated to what they're doing, and a lot of them really care about the environment as well. And it was, I really miss that career. It was, I've got lots of good connections that I made and friendships that I still have from that time. I would love nothing more than feeling like the industry was on the right track, that we had navigated a sustainable future for air travel, and I could go work on that technology knowing the policies were in place that meant we weren't going to destroy the planet. And, that's kind of our vision at Safe Landing is, fast forward to 2050, looking back, is that we realized as an industry that we needed to do something, and that this is in our own self-interest in terms of the industry, in terms of workers. And if we get those policies that we need, we can go about our work like knowing that we're working on something that is solving the problem. And you know what? It's going to be even more exciting. Like we talk about the 1950s as this kind of golden era of jet age development, and we can have that again. And we're actually holding ourselves back from those concepts that I was so passionate about working on, but never really got the chance to properly develop and implement. So I hope one day, like, I can be back doing that sort of stuff. And I really hope that for the industry anyway, even if I don't return, is that we get on the right trajectory and flight path.
Yeah, well, let me give you some hope. When I wrote my book, Sustainability in the Air with Dirk Singer, my co-author, what gave me true hope was we were looking for innovations from within the industry. What we really found was innovators outside the industry that are going to change the industry from the outside. So you look at Heart Aerospace, Zero Avia, Jet Zero, blended wing design, and a lot of the cutting edge engineering work is happening there. And I feel that these guys may act as a catalyst for the industry to then spur change. So don't lose hope if you did not see your ideas being taken up by Rolls a decade ago or some time ago. Things may change in the future, but because innovation is coming from outside, and also funding is going to a lot of these players with no previous aviation background that are building technology. So that's what gives me hope, a lot of hope on, and that's where the future might lie, where you don't join a traditional OEM who's been in aviation for 100 years. You join a new company and a startup which is building technology from the ground up.
Yeah, and I think having these discussions is really important. So I think that's why your podcast is so important. Like, actually, making sure that the conversations happen that then lead to those developments.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, thanks for having me on.
Sure. So just before we wrap up, I have a final round called the rapid fire round, in which we get to know you a bit more personally, and it's a bit more fun. So we'll start with a simple question, Finlay, for you. What is your favorite airline?
So it's difficult to answer this, but actually I'm going to say Loganair because they're based in Scotland. They fly to the Highlands and Islands. Hopefully they'll be one of the first airlines that introduce zero emissions aircraft because of some of the routes they fly. And I debated their CEO on Scottish TV, and it was a really good debate, so I'm going to go for them.
Okay, good answer. Good answer there. What's your favorite airport?
Favorite airport? I'll have to say Farnborough because I've been there quite a bit recently.
Did you fly in on a private jet?
No, I've never used its services.
Okay. What's your favorite book?
So Mike Berners-Lee has written a book called There's No Planet B, and that was quite an inspiration to me when I quit my job. I actually read that, and it's formed a lot of my thinking in terms of resource use and efficiency and that sort of thing. So, and also Mike Berners-Lee's going to speak at one of the events we're running in a month, so I thought I'd give him a shout out.
Oh, fantastic. Congratulations on that. It should be a big fanboy moment then. What's your favorite movie?
Could say Braveheart because it's Scottish, but yeah, I also like Into the Wild. It's a good kind of adventure journey story.
Nice. Both good choices. What is something you want to learn, Finlay?
So currently trying to learn a bit of gardening from my mum. She's really into her community gardening, and I've never had a garden before. So I've got an allotment where I'm starting to plant some things, but I'm an absolute novice, and I'm hoping that, in a few years' time, she will have passed on some of her brilliant knowledge to me.
Fantastic. What do you do in your free time when not gardening?
I don't do much gardening at the moment. I'm really into cooking and making new food as a way to relax. I really like hill walking, going up mountains in Scotland. And yeah, my girlfriend's massively into nature, so we spend a lot of our time walking around forests and looking for birds and animals and mushrooms and that sort of thing.
Oh wow, you're into mushroom hunting and foraging.
Yeah, and I've got a bit more confident at it, so we have actually found stuff and eaten it. Yeah.
Nice. Have you climbed Ben Nevis?
Of course I've climbed Ben Nevis, yeah. But it's definitely not the best mountain in Scotland. There's some incredible ones on the west coast, so don't go where all the tourists go. Okay.
What's the best advice you've received?
So there's something, when I was thinking about quitting my job, my mum sent me this quote, and it's something along the lines of, like, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And as I say, I get quite a lot of my kind of, I suppose, moral compass from my parents. And I do think a lot of people disagree with things, but it's quite easy to be a bystander. And so kind of putting yourself out there and actually saying something different, even if it's scary, I think is really important. So that one did stick with me, yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Finlay, thank you for being a good man and for doing something about it and not being a bystander. I do wish you all the best, and I've truly enjoyed this conversation.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our Sustainable Aviation Insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Mira Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimain is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.